Hello, everyone. Welcome to the book club. My name is Jess Kav, and I'm here with Caelainn Hogan and Emma Dabiri, who will be with in a couple of minutes. Today, we're going to be talking about two amazing books: "Don't Touch My Hair" by Emma Dabiri, and also "Republic of Shame" by Caelainn Hogan. And so, to do some intros, Caelainn Hogan was born in Dublin in 1988. Her journalism has featured in the New York Times Magazine, Harper's, the New Yorker, Vice Magazine, The Guardian, Al Jazeera, the Irish Times, and Dublin Review. Republic of Shame is her debut book. And we're going to start off with a reading from Caelainn Hogan.
Thanks, Jess, and thanks to First Fortnight for having us, and thank you to everyone for joining. This is just a short excerpt from the book about a woman I know, and I think it speaks to the generational impact of the religious-run institutions. So I wrote Republic of Shame about primarily the mother and baby home institutions and their ongoing legacy. And this is an extract from that. A woman I know told me something over coffee one day that she'd never previously mentioned. Her mother was born in one of the mother and baby home institutions, and the father was a priest. She described attending the priest's funeral with an archbishop present. She told anyone who asked that she was his grandchild. We were both around 30. Neither of us had children yet, but the idea of being pressured into giving a baby up for adoption was difficult even to contemplate. I'm not getting broody or anything, but I can't imagine what it would be like to have my baby taken away, she told me. She joked about how, if it had been us, we would have fought off the nuns to keep our kids. But I knew that it was a pointless thought experiment. The women who entered the institutions, who were sent to the institutions, were told they were shameful, that they couldn't provide the future a child deserved. They were promised that giving up their child was great and a redemptive act, allowing a good and respectable couple to experience the wonders of parenthood. A married couple could give their child everything, the nuns told them. The conversation was an example, one of many for me, while working on this book, of a strange paradox. It was hard for me and my contemporaries to imagine ourselves into the not-so-distant past of the mother and baby home institutions and Magdalen laundries. And yet, many people of our generation were still living with the legacy of the institutions.
Thank you so much. I really love that particular chapter. And one of the things that always stuck with me as well is this kind of idea, hey, Emma, this idea of if we were in that particular situation, we would have done things different. And I was reading the book, one of the things that came up was the conversation that you have with Sister Goretti, which I think is one of the Sisters of Charity in Blackrock. And she talks about the fact that it is just normal people, that these people come from space, these were everyday human beings that worked in there. You know, you talk to different nurses who, you know, are 18, they're naive, they're innocent, they're coming in and just want to help and they want to look after babies, and their intentions are pure and their intentions are good. And what can modern Ireland take from this? Do you feel like it's important for us to remember that these were normal people at that point?
I think it's important to realize how quickly the institutions were normalized, and that's, you know, and how easily and for how long they were normalized, because I think there's an idea that this was a completely secret system, and in some ways it was. People were sent there without their family knowing. People didn't really necessarily understand the extent of what happened behind the walls, but you know, society at large did know these institutions existed. The government was aware of the death rates in these institutions. You know, the priests, social workers in the 80s, in the 1980s and even 90s, you know, professional social workers were working within these institutions and, you know, spoke to me about the kind of eugenic approach to adoption, you know, kind of putting children into categories according to their mother's class or background. And so all of that was just sort of accepted as a normal system. It was what happened. And I think we see parallels of that today with, you know, the system of direct provision, emergency accommodation. But I, you know, when I started writing this book, I knew about the institutions, and, you know, growing up in Dublin, I had heard about the Magdalen laundries, but I'd never spoken to anyone who had firsthand experience of the institutions. And as soon as I did, I realized how close to home it was, that people I knew were affected, people I knew personally, that these institutions were, you know, right around the corner from my house, Temple Hill, where thousands of children were adopted from and, you know, separated from their mothers, is just around the corner from me. And I'd walked past it every day without knowing what it was. And people I know had sort of had to bring their child to the steps and hand them over to the nuns there. So, you know, I think it was realizing as well that this is not a distant past. One of the mother and baby home institutions operated until 2006. I was around, I think, 17 then. So,
Yeah.
you know, this could have been something that affected me. I could have been sent to an institution like this. This is
I remember that
not in the
comes up in
past.
it comes up in your book as well, that, you know, there's women who were born in 1988 in some of these institutions. And I remember going to Maryfield, and, you know, I talk about this in the poem that I performed at your book launch, was the fact that I remember kind of sitting there in transition year, or the year before transition year, and being talked to by the kind of previous transition year students, and being told that there's this old folks home across the road in Hyde Park, and that these women are really, you know, fun to look after because they all think they're teenagers, so they really love hanging out with other teenagers, and, you know, they like makeup and they like magazines and all this kind of stuff. And it was one of those things where I was like, why is that? Like, why are these older women, why do they think they're teenagers? That's obviously not right. That doesn't sound like it's a type of dementia. What's going on? And it was because they were institutionalized, and they were institutionalized when they were teenagers. They still lived in Hyde Park, and it was being spun to us, you know, these 15-year-old, 16-year-old girls, as an old folks home to go over and do charity in, you know. And it's interesting because I still feel like there is like an othering, you know, that there's an othering of the people who were involved within these religious run institutions, that it wasn't our community, that it wasn't, you know, the people that we knew, and it very much was.
People always say, oh, it was the times. And it's like, well,
Yeah.
you know, that's a huge span of time. You're talking about from the first years of the Irish state, the Magdalen laundries, you know, for decades before, but up until 2006. So I don't know how saying it was the times really solves that question. And I think it's something that's, you know yourself, is still affecting people's lives today. People are still denied their birth information, still having to go into an office in Dublin to search through ledgers for the name that their mother gave them when they were born. It's something that's being perpetuated in our names today, and affecting people we know, people our own age.
Absolutely.
And, you know, Emma, you write in your book about how the department, you know, sort of wrote about this in reports, you know, wrote about mixed race children in the institutions and how they categorized them and described them. And, you know, this was something printed in state and church documents. Women were called offenders and penitents in black and white in the records. You know, you can see it right there.
Yeah. It's, yeah, the categorization is something that really is viscerally upsetting, you know, within the way that these children were treated. And Emma, hello. I wanted to, hiya, how's it going? I was having to think about, you know, shame, and how shame comes up in, obviously, Republic of Shame, and how shame comes up in Touch My Hair. And, you know, one of the ways that is very prevalent is once again using like Christianity and religion as this kind of guise for oppression, you know. And that was for hundreds and hundreds of years, during the slave trade, and, you know, and colonialization, imperialism, up until now, we can argue, you know. And I wanted to talk a little bit about hair, and the kind of coded linguistic elements of hair, and how it's discussed in Don't Touch My Hair. And, you know, how did survivors of the slave trade keep their culture in their hair, when so much was taken away from them, where they were unable to be educated, where their language was taken away, their culture wasn't able to be practiced. And if you could talk a little bit about how the culture was kept within the hair and the treatment of it, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I go to that, I just want to kind of pick up on some of what you guys were saying before and kind of link that in. And I think that when you both were just talking about like how much this isn't just this kind of othering, and it's not something that's other people, it's only as and I think what we kind of underestimate is how pervasive all of this was in Ireland. Like, it's only as I've gotten older that I've realized the extent to which it affects people that I'm very close to, that it just wasn't spoken about. Like, I would never have known, you know, and the regularity actually with which it comes up, and the pervasiveness of people who have direct experience of these institutions is actually mind-blowing. And when I think about the country that I was growing up in, I think there was so much like unexplained or unarticulated, we wouldn't even have like the kind of language for it, but trauma that was just abounding, you know, within the culture. And as I've gotten older and realized the pervasiveness and the influence and the amount of people whose lives are directly touched by these institutions, I think that is one of the very direct sources of that trauma that has played out on the nation. And when it comes to shame specifically, and like linking that to hair, even before I get to the slave trade, even just thinking about how it operated in Ireland, and when I think about the shame that was attached to my hair texture, that was a shame that was, you know, attached to Blackness, and hair texture was an expression, was a very explicit expression of Blackness. And the shame that was attached to being of African descent or of Blackness was one that was, you know, in many ways like coded with this kind of like, there was a lot of stigma like around being mixed. I don't use the term mixed race for reasons that I actually go into more in my book that I've just finished, What White People Can Do Next, because I'm really trying to deconstruct race. I think we just far too easily, I don't want to go off on a tangent, but I think we need to be always dissolving race rather than reinvesting into it. And when we use the term mixed race, we give this truth status to the racial categories that we should be trying to dissolve. That's quite political. I understand why just like casually someone will describe themselves as mixed race. I've done it many times myself, but I am trying to be more mindful of not doing it. So let me just say mixed for now. But there was a stigma.
I would like to weigh in on that though in a bit, because I think that does also tie into the mother and baby homes and records and loss of self. But anyway, but please continue.
So I would say mixed rather than mixed race. I'm just wary of the word race. So yeah, the stigma attached to being mixed, to having like, I think particularly like a white mother and a Black father, there was so much, like there was always the assumption that my parents weren't married because my dad was Black. There's absolutely nothing wrong with not being married. But why do you assume that because it is a Black man and a white woman that they're not married, especially in a country where so much importance and, you know, civility was put upon marriage, and the assumption is that everybody is married. The assumption is that everybody is married. Why do you now assume that my parents aren't married? And there was this, certainly this stigma and this shame and this idea of it being very taboo to have slept with a Black man, you know, and then to be the product of that. And there was a sexualization around hair as well. There was this, something I write about in Don't Touch My Hair is this like slumber party that I went to, but this was something that, you know, was relatively common, but I just use this example of this kind of fake shock and, oh my God, there's pubes in the bed, and everybody's like, and they're like, oh no, it's just Emma's hair. And all of that kind of like association with your hair being something that's dirty, like that's sexualized and dirty, and then the associations between that and blackness. So that's just something that I wanted to kind of start off with. But if we go to more specifically to your question, yeah, I think, like, you know, hair styling culture, particularly with Afro textured hair, because our hair isn't something generally that we can just leave, you know, it requires knowledge and skills and expertise, and it requires knowledge of certain techniques. And for people, you know, that were from predominantly oral cultures, who already had a very lively and visual language of expression that existed through their hair, people often focus on the negative characteristics of Black hair, but for me, the emphasis is really in the wrong place. I think about all of the things that my hair is like capable of achieving. Like, if I want it bone straight, which I don't, but occasionally I do, but if I do, you know, I can achieve that. If I want to wear it up in incredibly like intricate sculpted architectural styles, I can also do that. Really, the breadth of diversity is only as limited as your imagination, and I guess your skill set. But because people could do so much with their hair, this was a material that they had, and that they, you know, did all of this really like beautiful art with. So when they're now, you know, kidnapped and transported across the world, they still have their hair. There's now this stigma attached to their hair that wasn't there in the African context. But that hair culture is something that remains, and in a way transmits messages and codes and information in a non-written you know, visual language. I guess the context changes in that there is now a stigma attached. There came to be a stigma attached to Afro textured hair. So you start to see people doing things that more manipulate the texture of their hair to maybe create a facsimile of more European textured hair. But even that transformation, I would locate still within the artistry and creativity and innovation that exists within Black hairstyling culture, which is always or often about transformation. It's just that the transformation, I guess the transformation shifts sometimes to be more about creating a facsimile of European hair. But the idea of transformation itself is something that's integral. My answers are so long. I'm so sorry. I'm so meandering.
No, not at all. I'm transfixed, and I'm thinking about, when you're talking, I'm thinking about time, and I'm thinking about the word that you use, which has really stuck with me, which is ancestral recall, and the ability to braid, and the ability to kind of be together in this room with other people with the same hair as you, and that's the ability of providing that safe space, and that kind of that salon mentality of a dissemination of ideas and all of these really important things that hair provides, was really, really beautiful. And obviously there's a little you know, in me, because when I was growing up, there was one place, there was a hairdresser's just on North Strand Road, and it was a white woman who was married to an African man, and she used to do my mom's hair, and we were able to go in there. But it was such a beautiful place where my mom felt accepted. She could talk about race, and she could talk about her identity, and also, you know, me and my sisters felt very welcome there, and we felt welcome with other, you know, people of color and other Black people, and it was really, really nice. And then I do remember that my mom did get her hair relaxed, and wasn't great.
You know what? I think I've been to this woman because it was the only person that could relax hair, and she had mixed children.
Yes.
Herself, and she relaxed hair.
Yeah.
And it wasn't very good. And it looked nothing like how you wanted it to look, you know, the swishy, flowing. It went down, but it was more like, you know, immobile and probably like burnt and broken. Yeah. I'm sure it's the same woman. I thought she was around the ILAC Centre, but I can't remember. I would have been very young when I went there, but I'm sure it's the same person.
I mean, it was really few and far between,
Yeah.
when my mom was growing up. And and for me, when it comes to hair, there was this kind of weird generational difference. And if anybody, by the way, who's tuning in, I keep saying tuning in, I'm such a zoomer. I'm going to keep saying it. Anybody who's tuning in who doesn't know, my mother is mixed race, and she was adopted from mother and baby home. So there is this kind of weird kind of mix where, like, here is my white grandmother not being able to do my mother's hair, which was 4A to kind of 4C, kind of quite really, really tightly coiled afro hair. And then here is my mother, who has never been given any knowledge about how to do her own hair, has 3-4 kids who are mixed race but very light skinned, with kind of long curly hair that she doesn't know what to do. So she used to get this like denim brush and brush the curls out, and and she'd do that without conditioning, without oil.
A denim brush, did you say?
Yeah, it's denim. It was like DEN.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, I know that brush well.
Remember that brush?
Yeah. I actually still have one.
Yeah.
I do a denim brush. Okay.
Okay, I see how.
And then I was like, "Ooh, there's an interesting historical connection there between denim and cotton," and my mind was getting really excited, but I was inventing it.
That's So yeah, denim brush, but yeah, she would brush the curls out. And there's pictures of like my baby sister when she was about 9 years old, with like the old woman hair where it's kind of like brushed out curls, but she's 9, and it's so that we've an interesting history, I guess, like familial history of hair for sure. What else was I going to ask? Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to talk about as well was the concept, and I think you brought it up during soundcheck, Caelainn, was the concept of time and cyclical time. And it really hit home with me when I was reading Don't Touch My Hair. And I think it's called Oriki, the Yoruba word.
Yeah.
And the idea that, there is the past, there is the future, there is the present, and so much of the past is within us. We have so much ancestral heritage, we've so much ancestral recall, and we are somehow simultaneously, bringing these things from the past, but also being in the present, but also kind of the future is somehow there, and it's all happening simultaneously. And I'd love you to talk a little bit about that, because I think right now it's such an important perspective to have. We are in a pandemic that happened nearly exactly 100 years ago. We have this rise of extremism that is happening. And, we seem to have this like collective amnesia of what the repercussions were for extremism. And we have this concept that is very imperialist and very Western and very colonialist, which is linear, that these things happened and everything is getting better and everything is improving and blah, blah, blah. But we also know that's not the case, that it's history repeating itself. So could you talk a little bit more about that before I keep going off?
Absolutely. I love that question. Like, thank you so much for raising this topic. And I always struggle sometimes when I say, sometimes I'm talking about colonialism, and actually in my new book, I'm talking about this like imperial knowledge being like, imposed on the world, everything from how, like, Greenwich Mean Time, from how time is measured, from how the volume of like liquids are measured, like basically this very European, but actually quite specifically English concept of reality being imposed on the world. And sometimes, someone will be like, oh, when I write English, they're like, do you not mean European? And I'm like, I can't really say European, because Ireland is also part of Europe. And a lot of this was also imposed on Ireland. It's not something that is organic within kind of pre-colonial like Irish thought. And something else that I find really interesting as well is a lot of even what we describe as English and quintessentially English was also imposed upon the English peasantry. That's kind of where the imposition of these ideas and the appropriation of lands that went on to kind of fuel the settler colonialism and the later colonialism beyond settler colonialism actually starts with the appropriation of land from the English peasantry by the elite. Something I do in my new book is really kind of drill down on this idea of white people and be like, who are you talking about? These are like very particular kind of cultural behaviors that stem from one group of people who have are racialized as white, but they're not necessarily like this is another conversation. We can do something else on that. But I am
2 hours, guys. Sorry.
It's why I picked up on even saying mixed race. I'm really white, black, mixed race. This is like an invention that's 400 years old, that is deeply, deeply destructive and damaging. I use these terms all the time myself. We believe that is like just a universal truth, but it's like really not. And I think we have to be like mindful of how we're using these terms and the work that reinforcing these racial categories is doing. But this is all in the new book. What did you actually ask me about? Time. Yes. Okay. So yeah. So you probably will have noted that I was a couple of minutes late to this. I have like incredibly, I find it incredibly difficult to be like punctual down to like the minute, you know, and there's this idea of like Black people's time, or like CPT as it used to be known, like colored people's time. You'll still sometimes hear people say CPT, and it's, you know, seen as something that is it's seen as something that's a problem. It's certainly not seen as something that is a positive kind of characteristic of like Black cultures. And it's something that I wanted to like go into in Don't Touch My Hair, because I was just like, why is it every kind of cultural norm that is Black or is non-Western is somehow deviant? And also like, where does it come from? And from this idea that like Afro textured hair is a burden because it's too time consuming to do, I'm like, that also doesn't make sense, because again, that's putting the onus like on my hair as being deviant. Like my hair is Afro textured hair is, we're created with this hair. Are you telling me that nature is wrong, but this imposition of like the 24-hour clock, industrialized time to best suit the interests of capital, that's right, that's natural, but that my hair is deviant? That doesn't make sense. So I actually kind of went into studying African concepts of time, and obviously Africa is a big generalization. So I focus specifically on the Yoruba because that's my paternal ancestry, but also because the Yoruba are one of the kind of main groups that were taken to the Americas as enslaved people. So yeah, I looked at how time was organized there, and it was, lo and behold, it was completely different. It wasn't like according to 7 days a week to the 24-hour clock. And I look at how people organized time before that was imposed, what their priorities were. One of their priorities was doing their hair. So, I mean, if your hair took like 2 days, so be it. Kind of this idea that time is what you make of it. If you've got a certain job that needs to be done, it just takes however long it takes, as opposed to how we have been conditioned to understand time, which is like, I've got 2 hours to do this, and the 2 hours start now and then they're over, and if it's not done, it's too long. That's not how it was understood. It was just like, I have to do this thing and it takes as long as it takes, you know? So it's a very different engagement with time. But a lot of that, sorry, just my mind is always all over the place. I'm trying to like say too many things at once. But about linear time, yeah, with Judeo-Christian time, there's this idea of like a very finite beginning, middle, and end that is even reflected in like the spiritual belief system. You know, you're born, you die, and if you've played your cards right and been subservient and done what you're told to do, you might have an afterlife. Whereas in Yoruba time, but also many African concepts of time and many non-Western concepts of time, time isn't seen as kind of this with this same kind of idea of linearity and finality, but it's seen as so rather than you're born, you die, and maybe you have an afterlife, it's like there are the ancestral spirits, there are us that's living, and then there's the unborn who are waiting to be born. But both the ancestral spirits and the unborn are already kind of amongst us or with us, and there's an idea of transmigration of the soul, and that the ancestors are born again, through the unborn, and that we are incarnations of our ancestors. And it's just a different engagement with time that believes in kind of like things kind of always being present rather than just being final and done with. And actually the idea is to make your life good in your lifetime, rather than to kind of suffer in misery and penitence in your lifetime because you might get to an afterlife, you know?
I love that idea of so much of that, but in particular this idea of subjective time. You know, how many times have we kind of given shit to ourselves because we've allocated 2 hours for something and it hasn't been done, you know, and we feel like it's our fault, you know, whereas if we actually say this is the activity that I'm going to do and whatever time it takes, that's what it's going to take. And I love that. Caelainn, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, you know, we're talking about time and we're talking about history and how we perceive history and how we perceive the present. And also, I want to talk a little bit about, if you don't mind, talking about the reports, because there's obviously been a lot of coverage in regards to the current investigation, and the fact that, you know, a huge part of the government was not willing to release this information to survivors. And, you know, myself and yourself, we've talked about how important that is for survivors to heal, for catharsis, for so many things. Would you be comfortable talking a bit about the report?
Yeah, of course. And I as well really enjoyed that concept of, although it's really interesting, that concept of Ariki and how sort of history explains the present rather, you know, than being a way to necessarily just define the past. And I think that, I mean, your book really brings out that idea of the importance of, you know, generational knowledge being passed on and the ancestors being present with us. I think there's, you read about, you know, like it's, if someone does well, it's proof of their ancestors doing well, sort of in that present. And I think that's what is so painful and difficult about people who were born in the institutions and haven't been able to connect with or even come to know their own heritage. I mean, Jess, we've talked so much about this, and, you know, still trying to find out about your own grandfather, and you know, it's one thing to know he was from Nigeria, or a Nigerian student, but to know whether he was Yoruba, whether he was Hausa, you know, those are important things to know that are so dismissed because of, you know, that idea for so long that Africa is just this one homogenous continent, and all the stigma that comes with it. And, you know, I think, Emma, your book just really brings to the fore the importance of that generational knowledge that's passed down. I think, you know, I mean, we all know the culture of, you know, like song in Ireland and oral tradition. So I think there's a lot of, you know, sort of parallels with that. But yeah, definitely the report. I mean, the report is coming out next week. This year is flying already. And it is, I think, hopefully it will be significant. Survivors have been waiting, talking about time, survivors have been waiting 5 years for this. You know, I started reporting the book in 2017, and the report was due to come out in a matter of months, I think, at that point, and it's been delayed and delayed. So it's been a really difficult process, I think, and has eroded a lot of trust. The constant delays, but also the process, and I think the denial and the ongoing barriers to information. So survivors who gave testimony to the confidential committee weren't allowed a transcript of their testimony. And, you know, the effect of trauma, I mean, First Fortnight has this focus on mental health. The effect of trauma affects, you know, the linearity of narratives, or not everyone speaks in linear narratives or has that sort of linear memory. So it's
trauma isn't linear as well.
It's not linear at all, and it really affects the way memory and everything.
And actually, I'm no physician, who is it that does physics? I can't even say. I'm certainly not one. Those ones, them ones. Anyway, apparently this idea of time, you know, all kind of unfolding simultaneously, that is seen as like quite esoteric and part of these like spiritual traditions, is actually borne out by, you know, by science. That's far from my area of expertise, but that's what I have recently read. So I was like, ooh, validation.
Yeah.
There's really interesting studies about how trauma is carried through generations, and even if you don't know, you know, the identity of your mother, that people have been shown to sort of carry trauma from you know, family members that they haven't even known. So, you know, it's science, you know, and it's biology. I mean, we carry it within our DNA. So it's, you know, I think that ongoing denial of information is so difficult, and the report is coming out. It, you know, we're still waiting to know the results of the test excavation in Sean Ross Abbey, where more than 1,000 children died. There's still mothers searching for where their children are buried, and, you know, adopted people in Ireland still don't have the right to their own birth information. So the report should provide answers, but not all, and people are still being denied the right to their own records. And that's why I think late last year, when there was this movement to repeal the sealing of those records that were all gathered by the investigation, there was such a pushback and such an outrage, because I think there's a sense that that culture of secrecy and shame is still being perpetuated through that denial of information.
I often think that we just, like, I have 2 children. I can't imagine, you know, having to give them up and then never being able to talk about that, and just living with that secret, as we just know so many people now, so many women in Ireland have had to. Like, I just think that level of unacknowledged and unspoken, because that's obviously going to affect how those women are to the children they go on to have later, how they are to the people around them. It's just this big well of trauma that's just, you know, not fully been reckoned with at all, you know.
Yeah,
and I think it has a huge impact on addiction rates in Ireland, and homelessness, and, you know, the ongoing institutionalization, you know, children being taken from parents and put in care, and often those parents might have been institutionalized themselves. So it just becomes this cycle. And, you know, I was reading a great book called There by Tommy Orange, who's a Native American writer, and he writes really well about how trauma is, you know, the fuel for, or often, you know, it underlies the crises in addiction and homelessness and displacement that affects so many communities.
And of course, so many Native Americans, really similar institutionalization, you know, taken away from their parents, often by Irish priests.
My
and nuns.
And that is exactly what they did. And they would separate the generations, because they were also oral tradition. So once they separated the generations, then they were no longer able to pass on that information to the next generation. But it also inhibited women to really work on their motherhood. So what they find is that you would have like kids separated from their mothers, maybe from born to maybe 10 or so on, and then they would come back into their community, but their mothers were not used to parenting, and so there would be this kind of fragmentation between generations that was incredibly painful. And then take into consideration that you also have like trauma that hasn't been managed, and yeah, they were, a lot of them were Catholic institutions. I'm just great. I'm just worried, not worried, but once again, I'm worried about time, guys. Because
my eye was on the clock as well, so I took a good fight, but I'm like, it is actually 1:39.
I wonder if I can pitch the first one like that. You know, time is really a construct, so we're just going to keep talking, but probably not. So what I would love to do is, we're kind of here and we're talking about history, and we're talking about healing, we're talking about perceptions of time, and maybe this is a really nice place for Emma to have a quick reading from Don't Touch My Hair and
Sure.
about African spirituality.
Yeah. And you know what I find is really, as I get older and I just see the kind of connections between so many different, I can't use the word diverse, it's just been destroyed for me. I can't use diverse or inclusive. I also write about why I can't use those words in my book. But I do see with my kind of specialization in Africa and West Africa, and my interest in that, and I'm now seeing kind of even beyond that, the resonances between some of what I'm about to read and so many different peoples in other continents and parts of the world, and the way in which, you know, like colonialism, the idea of the nation state and the capitalist order in which we all live under has eroded, kind of bulldozed over and destroyed a lot of these things that are basically like quite human tenets of coexisting. So this is specifically looking at examples across Africa, but you will find them in many other, you will find kind of similar in other places as well. Okay, so this is from like actually the last page of Don't Touch My Hair. So I'm giving away the end, but the book doesn't really work like that. About linearity and all that. So the beginning and the end. Oh yeah, the beginning and the end. So European history interrupted African development. Whatever markers we use, time, resources, food even, Africa was comparatively a place of abundance until Europeans arrived. Since that time, the continent has been materially impoverished. The best solutions offered today seem to be entirely dependent on economic systems that require inequality and exploitation in order to function. As the 21st century scramble for Africa rages on, the obsession with Africa's resources overlooks the continent's most valuable ones. Wole Soyinka suggests that this as yet untapped resource is the essence of African spirituality. Some might refer to it as Ubuntu, a philosophical concept from Southern Africa, the belief in a universal bond of sharing that connects all humanity. It has different names throughout the continent, but it's a concept recognizable across indigenous African cultures. Kofi Owusu Daku describes growing up in the rural Ashanti heartlands of Ghana, where the Akan word Mboa emphasized the importance of cooperation for better communal living. Among the Mande, Mugoya is the ideal of personhood, a concept that emphasizes caring for others. And it is in the Bamanan worldview, an individual human being is not necessarily a person. To achieve full personhood requires cooperation with others in the community. Professor Musa Dube of Duke University in North Carolina explains that if Ubuntu were practiced, ethnic discrimination, patriarchy, and the marginalization of people on the basis of class, sexuality, or race would be rendered meaningless. As Dube states, our failure to affirm and welcome the other only speaks of our failure to be human. I'm going to repeat that bit. Our failure to affirm and welcome the other only speaks of our failure to be human. I'm not going to read the next bit, and let me see if we should read this bit. Okay, I'll just quickly. Races of people cannot be conveniently divided along lines that decree one as good or the other as bad. And actually, in my next work, I go even further with the whole race thing. But at this stage, I'm still saying you can say one race is good, one race is bad. However, self-organizing systems can be either destructive or complementary to more equal systems for organizing society. Over the past 500 years, as Europe expanded and conquered the rest of the world, it imposed an operating system that encouraged individualism, the rapacious exploitation of resources, and the hoarding and accumulation of wealth. The invention of race and its offspring, racism, remain central to its operating logic. Today, as in the past, its agents are not all white. Many Black and brown imitators are active participants, freely operating for personal gain within a model of extraction and exploitation that was once imposed. This has been to date the enduring victory of colonialism. Yet if we observe Indigenous cultures from a more decolonized perspective, it becomes apparent in everything from divination to architectural design to the patterns of our braids that there exist self-organizing properties in African cultures, Indigenous African methods for doing self-organization, robust algorithms. There are ways of doing self-organization, of doing entrepreneurship that are gentle, that are egalitarian. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. If we could stop trying to reproduce African versions of Western norms doomed to fail at best, to destroy the earth at worst, if we could attune our senses to listen to the subaltern speak, we might, like our ancestors finding their way to the Palenque, discover the modern day pathways to the freedom that we seek. I'm sorry, you probably don't know what the Palenque is if you haven't read the book. Read the book.
Read the book. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Remember the first time I saw Audre Lorde, I was like, she is the image of my ma, and I was just like, that's class. Audre, yeah, they look really similar, Audre Lorde.
Well, she has a lot of Scottish ancestry as well. So.
Oh, does she?
Her grandfather was Scottish.
Wow. Okay. Cool. Thank you so much for sharing that. And it's there's so many. There's so far, by the way. Whoever is listening, we are open for questions. We only have 15 minutes left. At the moment, we have a lot of lovely statements from people. So thank you so much for sharing them. We have a couple of people wanting us to set up our own podcast. Just putting it out there, lady.
Oh my God, I'd love that.
Open to it, yeah.
Yeah, nail it. Absolutely nail it. So I want, so many of those concepts really touched me when I was reading them again the last couple of days. A lot of my emotional work has been through Buddhism and through mindfulness, and Ubuntu really reminded me of interbeing, and interbeing is a term that Thich Nhat Hanh uses to explain this idea of like, I cannot be without you, and you cannot be without me, and we cannot be without the sun. The sun is actually grand, but like that's Thich Nhat Hanh's exact words. But there's so many ways in which we exist where we need so much and so many things to also thrive, and we forget that with this individualist way in which, capitalism and consumerism and a lot of Western ideologies function is the purity of individualism, and it doesn't work, and we've seen that obviously with Trump and with the unbelievable narcissism that we see within Trump and followers of Trump and the Republican and all of that stuff. Sorry, go ahead.
I just want to add as well, somewhere we see it that's even more scary is we see it within activism, and we see it within movements that are supposed to be anti these things, because we have internalized this culture we've internalized neoliberalism. Like, capitalism has colonized all of our imaginations. I listen to Cornel West a lot, and he's been speaking lately a lot about, like, there's never been an activism moment before in which market relations have penetrated the activism so much. Like, everything is branded, everything is a brand, everything is working with these corporations. A lot of it is about like individual people who become, who have a kind of, how do I say it? It's, Cornel West says it better than me. But, it's often about like individual successes. There's another theorist I love called George Lipset. And he says, ethnic studies can do very well while ethnic people are doing very badly. So there can be these kind of token people who are speaking about it, and because they're speaking about it and they're highly visible, it's like, oh, this is fine. But meanwhile, most people who belong to that group are actually fucked, So yeah.
Well, I think with the storming of the Capitol, someone was saying, like, is it Kylie Jenner in that Pepsi ad where she comes along with the can and hands it to the police? It's like, where is
That's
she?
What went wrong. Yeah, we didn't have her.
It was there. Yeah, absolutely. We're going to probably have to finish up fairly soon, but I wanted to finish on where we are at this particular time is a redefinition of community. And now that we are, a lot is online and we're not able to really be together at the moment, and we don't know when that's going to be. And to be honest, I feel even when things shift again, I think there will still be a need for redefinition of community. And I wanted to talk a bit more about that, but we don't have a huge amount of time. So can I ask maybe both of you, Caelainn, can you talk a bit about what do you see when you think about a redefinition of community, especially for Ireland and modern Ireland?
I think, I think there's so many communities in Ireland that have been marginalized or denied their Irishness in a lot of ways. And I think we are coming to face that and need to face that more. I think, having seen some of the solidarity within the survivor community, I think that's incredibly important. My mind just keeps going back to the mention of the subaltern and Spivak's essay on Can the Subaltern Speak, and this idea of giving voice as well. And I think, Emma, like when you edited that really important issue of the Irish Times Magazine, you talked about accepted narratives and challenging them, and who gets to write their narrative. And I think I'm really I think it's really important to think about that idea of giving voice. And I'm really uncomfortable when people sort of say, oh, you're giving voice to the voiceless. And it's a way we think about writing and about narratives and about journalism that I think needs to change. No one can give a voice to someone. I think, we need to provide space or respect the agency of people who have gone through trauma, who have been marginalized or institutionalized. And I think that's something that needs to change in terms of, we always talk about communities and providing communities a voice, but I think it's respecting the voices of people and their experiences and them being experts of their own experience. And change within publishing and writing, and it needs to be a real change, I think.
Absolutely. And Emma, how would you, what do you see? What do you see in yourself, or what do you think of when you think of a redefinition of community moving forward?
I think we have to fucking get offline, which is going to be like really difficult.
Yeah.
In this moment. But I don't know, literally a lot of online discourse over here is like imploding at the moment. It's really I don't know, like I say, it's that penetration of market relations into like social justice spaces, and I don't know if it's as far gone in Ireland as it is here. I think perhaps not. And I also feel like in Ireland, there has been there's been recent evidence of real grassroots, kind of activism making substantive change in a way that's like very hopeful, in a way that I haven't seen happening over here, where there seems to be like a lot more just kind of posturing online rather than, and I think maybe it has to do with Ireland being so much smaller, with there actually being more of a sense of community, like in Ireland than there is than there is in London.
Physical, spatial element,
Yeah, but also something I've noticed, like for instance, is like the homelessness in Ireland, right? Like most people I know would talk about that and feel actually like affected and invested in it, whereas I would notice most people here, unless maybe that's the thing that that's their kind of their issue or their cause that they kind of advocate for. I don't know, it's kind of, I just feel because there's so many more people here, it's so much bigger that like, it feels like there's not the same investment in what's sometimes going on in the country. There's just more, oh, that's happening in America, let's talk about that. People are more like disparate and more disconnected. And I think like a lot of that is being fueled by things that are happening online. I think it's really important that people have this building of like mass movements and grassroots organizations that actually meet in like the non-digital realm and aren't just communicating with each other via social media. Don't get me wrong, like social media is like a revolutionary thing that has the power to bring so many people, you know, together in ways that wouldn't have been previously possible. And I think for minoritized people of any group, when I think about like how isolated I was growing up, that wouldn't really happen again. Even if you were in a country that was kind of solely white, as Ireland almost was then, you would still be able to create some kind of online, at least online community with people in other countries. I don't think people are really going to experience that level of isolation again. That's a wonderful thing. But I feel social media is just a very poisoned chalice, and a lot of the benefits of it are now, you know, kind of being overrun by also all the very pernicious aspects of it, and the way, as I've said, that market relations is kind of dictating how a lot of things are playing out on social media.
Yeah, absolutely. And I back to when I lived in London, even during that brief time, and you know, it was so hard for me to make friends or to maintain friendships. Actually, you know what? It was easy for me to make friends and it was hard to maintain friendships. I remember that in London because everybody is so spaced out. And I wonder, is it, you know, it's that hyper individualism where you live in a city that's so large, that it's so oversaturated, that you don't even know where to start with interacting and meeting people and finding people. And you're absolutely right that, you know, the kind of your front doorstep is where you should begin. And also, you know, going back to my own emotional work, like Thich Nhat Hanh, he talks about, you know, the revolution starts from within, you know, and that's where we have to begin. And, you know, after the within, it's maybe your front doorstep, and it's, you know, your local community center, and it's figuring out how to engage and how to talk to people face to face. And, you know, the language, the way in which we speak to each other online can just be so harsh and so easy to misinterpret, and so it can really at times inhibit the galvanization that we really need for change, you know. Thank you so much. This has been such a beautiful conversation, and I wanted to finish with maybe some book recommendations for people who are watching for 2021. Caelainn, would you like to start?
Definitely. And just to follow up on what you were saying, I think, you know, who's on our doorstep, and we've seen how reaching out to people has brought progress in Ireland, has brought real change in Ireland through marriage equality. I mean, there was that campaign of like, call your grandparents, you know, don't assume someone's bias, or don't assume that someone won't understand your experience. And I think that breaking of silences in Ireland has been so important, and remembering to just reach out to the people around you and actually have conversations, have those difficult conversations. I think that's brought real change in Ireland. Reading recommendations over the past year, I think, talking about how race is a construct, I am reading a great book called How the Irish Became White, which is really interesting, and about how that, you know, the Irish weren't perceived as white in some ways in the US, and how they then used sort of racial privilege to attain power. So that's an interesting read. Claudia Rankine's new book, Just Us, as well, is a great read. And I just finished Freshwater by Akaweke Emezi, which is really very interesting. And I think when you were talking about personhood and how, you know, and she talks about how many sort of identities and genders can sort of, you know, be included in the same person, and breaking down binaries. So those are our 3 books that I would recommend.
Beautiful, thank you so much. And Emma, do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, that's such a great list, by the way. I haven't read.
I've enjoyed reading them.
Yeah, I love it. I haven't read Freshwater, but I know she draws a lot on like Igbo philosophy, Igbo metaphysics. So yeah, I obviously forgot to do this, but I'll just off the cuff. Okay, so I'm obsessed with this book called Futures of Black Radicalism. Just read it. Like, it's literally, I'm like, the anti-racist texts that are just like specifically anti-racist are to me like a lot less I get a lot less from them than I get from books written in the Black radical tradition, which are not framing everything as, they frame things in a different way, basically, and they come out of a different tradition that is not necessarily like corporate diversity, inclusion, scope. It's more grounded out of, it's more located within, I guess, traditions that have different concepts of subjectivity, if that makes sense, and are radical as opposed to diverse. One of the concepts I talk about in the book is from, in the new book, is another book I would say is Black Study, no, oh my God, The Undercommons, Black Study and Fugitive Planning. These are actually theory books, sorry, they're not necessarily easy reads either, but if everybody read them, wow, if everybody read them and like, you know, like understood them, we'd be having different, we'd be having to,
I think we're just at the end here.
Oh, okay.
I'm afraid I'm going to get my Oscar walking off a bit any very soon. So I just want to say massive thank you to the book recommendations. Thank you so much for an enlightening and stimulating discussion. Thank you to Hogan. Thank you, Dabiri. If you're interested in any of the books that we discussed today, we will make a list of them and put them in First Fortnight. First Fortnight also have their own book list called Mind Reading, and that's going to be all over their socials that you can check out as well. And a massive thank you to UNESCO, Dublin City of Literature, for supporting this particular event. Also, I want to talk about the open forum that we have at the moment too. I'm going to be working with First Fortnight to make sure that, I'm going to be using the terms that you love, Emma, to make sure that moving forward is more diverse and inclusive. So I'll be talking with different organizations. I will be engaging with different communities. And also we have a survey up online. We would have loved to have done this in person with you guys, but of course it was not meant to be. So we will have a survey up online that you can take. That data will be used, as anybody who's working in the creative industry right now knows, this all about funding. It's all about the data that you have moving forward and making sure that we continue being as creative, breaking down these barriers, make sure everybody is included within these different events. I think that's everything. Yeah, so massive thank you to First Fortnight, and thank you again, guys. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you. Oh, also, yes, the survey, there's going to be a competition. So if you do a survey, you will be in a chance for a beautiful offer from Dr. & Co. There you go. Thank you so much, guys, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thanks, everyone.